You watch people dismiss your ideas in meetings while nodding enthusiastically at someone else's identical suggestion minutes later. Every day you witness colleagues with less expertise commanding rooms while your insights fall on deaf ears, leaving you frustrated and questioning your own influence. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I mastered the art of psychological influence in the most treacherous courts of Renaissance Italy, where a single misstep meant exile or death. For over 500 years, leaders have secretly used my principles to command respect, loyalty, and obedience from anyone they encounter. What I discovered about human psychology will transform how people respond to you, giving you the power to make others eager to follow your lead instead of ignoring your voice. The same strategies that helped princes rule kingdoms can help you rule any room, relationship, or situation. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Machiavellian wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for true influence. Let me tell you about the day I learned that all influence is psychological. When I lost everything I thought mattered and discovered what truly controls human behavior. It was February 1513, and I was being dragged through the cobblestone streets of Florence in chains. Just months before, I had been one of the most powerful men in the Republic, serving as secretary to the Second Chancery, commanding respect from diplomats and nobles across Italy. Now I was accused of conspiracy against the returning Medici family, my former enemies who had reclaimed control of my beloved Florence. The irony was crushing. I had spent 14 years mastering the art of political maneuvering, believing that intelligence, competence, and loyalty would secure my position. I had negotiated with kings, advised generals, and shaped the destiny of nations. Yet here I was, stripped of everything because I had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power itself. In the dark, damp cell of the Bargello prison, suspended by ropes that cut into my wrists during interrogation, I experienced a revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about human influence. The guards who tortured me weren't motivated by personal hatred. They were following orders from men who had never met me. The Medici who condemned me weren't acting from malice. They were eliminating perceived threats to their psychological control over Florence. That's when I understood the brutal truth. Power isn't about what you know, what you've accomplished, or even what you deserve. Power is entirely about what others believe about you, what they fear from you, and what they think they can gain or lose through their relationship with you. Every night in that cell, as I listened to the screams of other prisoners and felt the rats scurrying across my feet, I reconstructed every political victory and defeat I had witnessed. I analyzed every moment when I had seen influence shift from one person to another. The pattern became crystal clear. Those who wielded lasting power understood humans' psychology better than human politics. The torture taught me more about influence than any diplomatic mission ever had. I watched how my captors responded to different approaches, how defiance triggered more violence, how apparent submission created opportunities, how strategic information sharing could shift their behavior. I was conducting psychological experiments under the most extreme conditions imaginable. When they finally released me 6 weeks later, after the conspiracy charges couldn't be proven, I was a different man. The Niccolò Machiavelli who entered that prison believed in merit and justice. The one who emerged understood that the only currency that truly matters in human relationships is psychological advantage. I had lost my position, my income, my reputation, and nearly my life. But I had gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that every human interaction is a contest of psychological influence, and that understanding this truth gives you the power to win any game others don't even realize they're playing. In my exile to my small estate in Sant'Andrea, stripped of power and income, I began the work that would unlock the deepest secrets of human psychology. What emerged was not just a book, but a manual for understanding the hidden mechanisms that drive every human decision. I called it Il Principe, the Prince, but what I was really writing was the first comprehensive guide to psychological influence. Every page contained insights I had gathered from observing the most powerful and manipulative people of my era, combined with the brutal lessons learned from my own spectacular fall. The genius of psychological influence lies in understanding that humans are not rational creatures making logical decisions. We are emotional beings who use logic to justify what we've already decided to feel. This revelation transformed everything I thought I knew about persuasion and control. When I studied Cesare Borgia, the most feared man in Italy, I didn't focus on his armies or his wealth. I watched how he made people want to please him, how he created an atmosphere where opposing him felt not just dangerous, but somehow wrong. Borgia understood that true power comes from shaping how people think about themselves in relation to you. The secret is this: every person you meet is constantly asking themselves three psychological questions, whether they realize it or not. First, will this person help or hurt my status? Second, does this person see me the way I want to be seen? And third, what does this person want from me, and what will happen if I don't give it to them? Master these three psychological triggers, and you can influence anyone. Ignore them, and you'll find yourself wondering why your best arguments fall on deaf ears, while others with inferior ideas command instant respect and obedience. The first trigger, status concerns, is perhaps the most powerful. Humans would rather be wrong and maintain their perceived status than be right and feel diminished. This is why correcting someone publicly destroys your influence over them, while finding ways to make them feel important creates instant psychological bonds. I learned this watching Pope Alexander VI manipulate cardinals who despised him personally but needed his approval professionally. He never demanded respect directly. Instead, he created situations where showing him respect made them feel powerful themselves. The cardinals convinced themselves they were choosing to honor him, never realizing they were being psychologically maneuvered. The second trigger, identity validation, explains why the same message can succeed or fail, based entirely on how it makes the listener feel about themselves. When you make people feel seen and understood in the way they want to be seen, they become psychologically invested in your success. They begin to view challenges to your authority as challenges to their own judgment. The third trigger, consequence awareness, must be handled with surgical precision. People need to understand what they gain by following you and what they lose by opposing you. But this understanding must feel like their own conclusion, not your threat. I spent countless hours by candlelight documenting these psychological patterns, knowing that I was creating something that could reshape the balance of power for anyone who truly understood its principles. The prince was my revenge against those who had destroyed me, not through violence or conspiracy, but through the ultimate weapon, knowledge of human nature itself. What I discovered was that influence isn't about changing people's minds. It's about understanding what they already want and positioning yourself as the path to getting it. During my diplomatic missions to France, I discovered one of the most powerful psychological techniques for gaining influence: the art of becoming a human mirror. I learned this from watching how the most successful courtiers managed to gain favor with King Louis XII, while others with equal qualifications were ignored or dismissed. The courtiers who thrived didn't try to impress the king with their own accomplishments or ideas. Instead, they had mastered the ability to reflect back to him exactly what he needed to see about himself. They became psychological mirrors, showing him the version of himself that matched his deepest desires and self-image. I realized that every person you encounter is desperate to see a particular version of themselves validated in your eyes. They want to believe they are intelligent, important, capable, respected, or whatever identity matters most to them. When you can reflect this desired identity back to them, you create an almost irresistible psychological bond. The mirror principle works because it operates on the deepest level of human psychology, our need for identity confirmation. People don't just want to feel good about themselves, they want to feel that others see them the way they see themselves, or better yet, the way they want to see themselves. I perfected this technique during negotiations with various Italian princes. Instead of presenting myself as someone they should listen to, I presented myself as someone who truly understood who they were. I would spend hours before each meeting studying not just their political positions, but their personal vanities, their insecurities, and their aspirations. With Duke Guidobaldo of Urbino, who prided himself on being a patron of arts and learning, I positioned myself as a fellow intellectual who recognized his sophisticated understanding of classical philosophy. I didn't flatter him directly, that would have seemed obvious and manipulative. Instead, I asked questions that allowed him to demonstrate his knowledge, then reflected back his insights with the kind of deep appreciation that confirmed his identity as a Renaissance scholar. The psychology behind mirroring is simple but profound. When someone feels truly seen and understood by you, they begin to associate you with the positive feelings they have about themselves. You become, in their mind, someone who gets it, someone who recognizes their true worth. This creates a psychological debt. They feel compelled to reciprocate the good feelings you've created. But mirroring must be authentic and subtle. People can sense fake flattery, and obvious manipulation destroys trust instantly. The key is to genuinely identify what they want to be true about themselves, then create opportunities for them to experience that truth in your presence. I learned to mirror not just personalities, but communication styles, values, and even subtle physical behaviors. When speaking with cautious, deliberate thinkers, I would slow my speech and pause thoughtfully before responding. With passionate, quick-minded individuals, I would match their energy and speak with similar intensity. The most advanced form of mirroring involves reflecting someone's aspirational identity, who they want to become rather than who they currently are. This creates even stronger psychological bonds because you're associating yourself with their dreams and ambitions, not just their current reality. However, the mirror principle comes with a warning. You must never let people see you changing your reflection for different audiences. If someone realizes you're deliberately mirroring them, or if they see you reflecting contradictory identities to different people, the technique backfires catastrophically. They'll view you as manipulative and untrustworthy. The most successful practitioners of psychological mirroring become like high-quality mirrors, so clear and responsive that people forget they're looking at a reflection at all. They believe they're simply interacting with someone who naturally understands and appreciates their true self. I once spent an afternoon with Leonardo da Vinci examining his drawings of Fortune's wheel, that ancient symbol of how fate raises and lowers human circumstances. As we discussed the mechanics of the wheel, Leonardo made an observation that revolutionized my understanding of psychological influence. The wheel moves constantly, but the wise man knows when to leap aboard and when to step away. This conversation led me to develop what I call the fortune wheel strategy, the art of recognizing when people are psychologically most vulnerable to influence and when they are most resistant to it. Timing, I discovered, is not just important in psychological influence. It is everything. Human psychology operates in predictable cycles. People move through phases of confidence and insecurity, openness and defensiveness, hope and despair. Those who master influence learn to read these psychological rhythms and time their approaches accordingly. Strike when someone is in the wrong psychological state, and even the most brilliant argument will fail. Strike when they're in the right state, and even mediocre ideas can seem like revelations. I learned this lesson during my negotiations with the French court. My first attempt to convince them to support Florentine interests came at a moment when they were flushed with recent military victories and feeling invincible. They dismissed my proposals without serious consideration. 6 months later, after suffering unexpected defeats, I presented nearly identical proposals to the same officials. This time, they embraced my ideas as exactly what they needed to hear. The psychological state had changed completely. In their moment of triumph, they saw no need for new alliances or strategies. In their moment of uncertainty, they were hungry for solutions and guidance. The message remained the same, but the timing transformed everything. People are most susceptible to influence during 3 specific psychological moments: when they're facing new challenges that exceed their current capabilities, when they're experiencing doubt about their current approach, and when they're emotionally elevated by recent success, but unconsciously worried about maintaining it. Conversely, people are most resistant to influence when they're actively defending against criticism, when they're committed to a course of action they've publicly announced, and when they're feeling confident about their current circumstances. The key is learning to recognize these psychological seasons in real time. I developed the ability to read subtle signals, changes in posture, voice, tone, the specific words people choose, and especially what they don't say. Someone who suddenly begins justifying decisions they've never felt the need to explain before is entering a phase of psychological vulnerability. I also learned to create optimal timing rather than simply wait for it. By asking the right questions or sharing specific information at strategic moments, you can shift someone's psychological state from resistance to receptivity. This isn't manipulation, it's creating conditions where good ideas can be properly considered. During my time observing Cesare Borgia, I watched him demonstrate this principle masterfully. He never made important requests of his subordinates during their moments of confidence or stress. Instead, he would create situations that naturally led them to seek his guidance, then present his desires as solutions to problems they had identified themselves. The fortune wheel strategy also requires understanding that your own psychological timing matters just as much as theirs. Attempting to influence others when you're in a state of desperation, anger, or overeagerness broadcasts your emotional state and automatically triggers defensive responses in others. I learned to approach important conversations only when I could embody the psychological state I wanted to create in others. If I wanted them to feel calm and thoughtful, I ensured I was genuinely calm and thoughtful. If I wanted them to feel energized and optimistic, I waited until I could authentically project those qualities. The most sophisticated application of this strategy involves recognizing that different people have different psychological rhythms. Some individuals are most open to new ideas in the morning when their mental energy is fresh. Others become more receptive later in the day as their defenses naturally lower. Some respond well to gradual approaches over time, while others prefer concentrated, intensive interactions. Master the fortune wheel strategy, and you'll find that influence becomes less about force and more about perfect timing, stepping aboard the wheel exactly when it will carry you where you want to go. In the hills outside Florence, I once watched a confrontation between a wild boar and a fox that taught me everything about adapting influence strategies to different personalities and situations. The boar, massive and aggressive, charged directly at any threat. The fox, small and clever, used misdirection and cunning to achieve its goals. Both were successful, but in completely different ways. This observation led me to develop what I call the lion and the fox method, the psychological principle that effective influence requires knowing when to use direct strength and when to employ subtle cunning. Most people fail at influence because they use only one approach. regardless of the situation or the person they're trying to influence. The lion represents direct, powerful influence, clear expectations, obvious consequences, and straightforward communication. The fox represents indirect, clever influence, subtlety, misdirection, and psychological maneuvering. Mastered influencers seamlessly shift between these approaches based on what each specific situation and person requires. I learned this lesson painfully during my early diplomatic career. When dealing with Duke Valentino, I initially tried the fox approach: subtle suggestions, diplomatic language, and careful maneuvering around his ego. He saw right through it and responded with contempt. Only when I switched to direct, honest communication about mutual benefits and clear consequences did I gain his respect and cooperation. Conversely, when negotiating with the cautious merchants of Venice, my initial direct approach triggered their defensive instincts. They responded to subtle suggestion and gradual relationship building far better than to direct requests or obvious pressure. The key is learning to read which approach each person's psychology requires. Lion types respond to strength, clarity, and direct communication. They want to know exactly where they stand, what you expect, and what will happen if those expectations aren't met. These individuals often respect bold moves and despise what they perceive as weakness or manipulation. Fox types respond to subtlety, options, and collaborative problem solving. They prefer to feel like they're discovering solutions rather than being told what to do. Direct pressure often triggers resistance in these personalities, while gentle guidance allows them to maintain their sense of autonomy. The most sophisticated application of this method involves recognizing that the same person may require different approaches at different times or in different contexts. A colleague who responds well to direct communication about project deadlines might need a fox approach when discussing personal development or sensitive feedback. I discovered that situational factors also determine which method will be most effective. Public settings often require more subtle approaches, as direct pressure can trigger face-saving responses. Private conversations allow for more direct communication. High-stress situations may call for clear, lion-like direction, while creative collaborations benefit from fox-like exploration. The lion approach works best when you have established authority, when the stakes are high and time is limited, when dealing with personalities that respect direct power, and when the consequences of inaction are severe. It involves clear communication of expectations, transparent discussion of consequences, confident body language, and decisive action. The fox approach excels when you lack formal authority, when relationship preservation is crucial, when dealing with sensitive personalities or topics, and when you need creative solutions rather than compliance. It requires patient relationship building, strategic questioning that leads people to their own conclusions, creating options rather than demands, and allowing others to maintain dignity and autonomy. During my time studying the various Italian princes, I noticed that the most effective leaders unconsciously switched between these approaches based on the person and situation. They would be lions with subordinates who needed clear direction, and foxes with equals who required collaborative persuasion. The danger lies in mismatching your approach to the person or situation. Using lion tactics with fox personalities creates resentment and resistance. Using fox tactics with lion personalities creates confusion and disrespect. The art lies in quickly assessing which approach will be most effective and adapting accordingly. I also learned that sometimes the most powerful strategy is to demonstrate that you're capable of both approaches. When people know you can be either a lion or a fox, they become more responsive to whichever approach you choose to employ. They understand that your current method is a choice, not a limitation. The most controversial lesson I learned about psychological influence came from watching Francesco Guicciardini, navigate the treacherous waters of papal politics. He taught me that complete honesty, while morally appealing, can be psychologically destructive to both the speaker and the listener. The art of influence requires mastering what I call necessary deception, the strategic management of truth. Let me be clear. I am not advocating for malicious lying or deceit intended to harm others. What I discovered is that humans cannot psychologically handle complete truth in most situations, and that selective truth-telling is often the kindest and most effective approach to influence. Consider this reality. When someone asks, "How do I look?" they are not seeking objective truth about their appearance. They are seeking psychological reassurance and emotional support. The person who responds with brutal honesty may feel morally superior, but they have failed to understand the true nature of the interaction and have likely damaged their influence with that person. The same principle applies to more complex situations. When a colleague presents an idea that has significant flaws, the choice isn't between lying and telling the truth. The choice is between different ways of communicating truth that will either preserve your influence and help them improve, or destroy your influence and leave them defensive and resistant to change. I learned to distinguish between three types of truth: absolute truth, what actually is; necessary truth, what the person needs to know to make good decisions; and destructive truth, information that serves no productive purpose but would cause psychological harm. Effective influence requires becoming skilled at delivering necessary truth while avoiding destructive truth. This isn't about protecting people from reality, it's about presenting reality in ways that enable them to receive it constructively rather than defensively. During my diplomatic missions, I discovered that timing and framing transformed the psychological impact of the same information. The treaty terms that would be rejected as insulting when presented directly could be accepted when positioned as a starting point for negotiation. The criticism that would trigger defensiveness when delivered bluntly could inspire improvement. When wrapped in recognition of strengths, the key insight is that people's psychological state determines their ability to process different types of information. Someone who is already feeling insecure cannot handle additional criticism, regardless of its accuracy. Someone who is overconfident cannot receive warnings about potential problems. The skilled influencer learns to read these psychological states and adjust their truth-telling accordingly. I also learned the power of strategic omission. Sometimes the most influential approach is not adding information, but removing it. When people are overwhelmed by complexity, they make poor decisions. By presenting only the essential elements needed for good decision-making, you increase the likelihood of positive outcomes. However, necessary deception requires strict ethical boundaries. The information you withhold or reframe must serve the other person's legitimate interests, not just your own. The test is simple. If they knew everything you know, would they still make the same decision? If the answer is yes, then your strategic truth-telling is ethical. If the answer is no, you have crossed into manipulation. I developed techniques for strategic truth-telling that preserved both honesty and influence. Instead of direct contradiction, I learned to ask questions that led people to discover problems themselves. Instead of crushing someone's enthusiasm with harsh realities, I learned to channel that enthusiasm toward more realistic goals. Instead of delivering bad news directly, I learned to prepare people psychologically so they could receive it constructively. The most advanced form of necessary deception involves helping people maintain faith while accepting new information. When someone has committed publicly to a position that needs to change, direct confrontation forces them to choose between admitting error and defending an untenable position. Strategic communication provides them with ways to evolve their position while maintaining dignity. What I discovered is that influence is not about making people do what you want, it's about creating psychological conditions where they can choose to do what's best for everyone involved. Sometimes this requires presenting information in ways that enable good decision-making, rather than in ways that satisfy your own need to be completely direct. During my years observing the rise and fall of various princes, I made a disturbing discovery. Loyalty is almost never earned through kindness, competence, or even gratitude. True loyalty is manufactured through psychological processes that create emotional investment and personal stake in your success. Understanding this loyalty equation changed everything about how I approached relationships and influence. I learned this lesson by watching two very different leaders. The first was universally loved, generous, fair, and considerate to everyone around him. The second was more demanding and strategic in his relationships. When crisis struck, the beloved leader found himself abandoned by people who had benefited from his kindness for years. The strategic leader retained fierce loyalty from people who continued to support him even when it cost them personally. The difference wasn't in how they treated people, it was in how they structured the psychological relationship between themselves and others. The beloved leader had created dependence. The strategic leader had created stakeholders. The loyalty equation works on a simple principle. People become loyal to situations where they have invested something of value and where their own success is tied to your success. Loyalty isn't created by giving people things. It's created by getting people to give things to you, and by making them feel that your victories are their victories. This seems counterintuitive, but psychological research I've observed through centuries of human behavior confirms it. When someone invests time, effort, or reputation in supporting you, they become psychologically committed to your success. Their investment creates a mental need to justify that investment, which manifests as loyalty. I watched this principle work with Cesare Borgia's most trusted allies. They weren't the people he had helped the most, they were the people who had taken the greatest risks to help him. When someone has publicly supported you or made sacrifices for your cause, they become psychologically invested in proving that their judgment was correct. The key is creating opportunities for people to invest in your success voluntarily. This might mean asking for their expertise on important decisions, involving them in planning processes, or giving them opportunities to contribute their time and energy to projects they care about. Each investment creates psychological ownership. I also discovered the power of shared victories and shared struggles. When people work with you to overcome challenges or achieve goals, they develop emotional attachment to both the process and the outcome. They begin to view your success as validation of their own judgment and effort. The most powerful form of manufactured loyalty comes from what I call collaborative achievement. When you help someone accomplish something they couldn't achieve alone, while making it clear that your success contributed to theirs, you create a psychological bond that goes beyond mere gratitude. They see you as an essential part of their own success story. However, there's a crucial difference between manufacturing loyalty and manipulating people. Ethical loyalty building creates genuine mutual benefit and emotional satisfaction for everyone involved. A person becomes loyal not because they've been tricked, but because the relationship genuinely serves their interests and values. I learned to structure relationships so that supporting me became the natural way for others to support themselves. This might mean aligning my goals with their goals, creating projects where their success required my success, or positioning myself as the pathway to things they genuinely wanted to achieve. The loyalty equation also requires understanding that different personalities invest in different ways. Some people invest through intellectual contribution. They become loyal when you value their ideas and expertise. Others invest through emotional support. They become loyal when they feel needed during difficult times. Still others invest through practical contribution. They become loyal when they can contribute skills or resources to meaningful outcomes. I also discovered that loyalty must be maintained through continued opportunities for investment. People need to feel that their relationship with you continues to serve their interests and values. Loyalty that isn't renewed through ongoing mutual benefit will eventually fade, regardless of how strong it once was. The most sophisticated application of the loyalty equation involves creating networks of people whose success depends partly on each other's success, with you as a crucial connecting point. When multiple people in your network benefit from supporting each other, and you facilitate those connections, you become indispensable to the entire system. But remember, manufactured loyalty must be genuine loyalty. The goal isn't to trick people into supporting you, it's to create relationships where supporting you is genuinely the best way for them to achieve their own goals and express their own values. The most uncomfortable truth I learned about psychological influence is that fear, when properly calibrated, creates more reliable obedience than love ever can. I discovered this by watching the aftermath of Cesare Borgia's conquest of Sinigaglia, where a single act of calculated intimidation secured more lasting compliance than years of generous treatment ever could have achieved. Let me be absolutely clear. I am not advocating for cruelty, terrorism, or abuse. What I learned is that humans need to understand consequences in order to make rational decisions, and that strategic use of fear prevents far more harm than it causes. The fear factor formula is about creating respect for boundaries, not about causing suffering. The psychology behind fear-based influence is straightforward. Humans are motivated more by avoiding loss than by gaining benefits. When people understand what they might lose by opposing you, they naturally align their behavior with your interests. The key is making the consequences clear, predictable, and proportional. I watched Borgia demonstrate this principle after capturing several lords who had conspired against him. Instead of executing them all immediately, which would have been expected, he executed only the ringleader, publicly, dramatically, and with clear explanation of why this consequence followed from the choice to betray him. The psychological impact on other potential conspirators was far greater than if he had simply killed them all quietly. The fear factor formula has 4 essential components: clarity, inevitability, proportionality, and consistency. People must understand exactly what behaviors will trigger consequences. They must believe those consequences will definitely occur. The consequences must fit the severity of the violation, and the system must apply equally to everyone. Without clarity, people cannot make informed decisions about their behavior. Without inevitability, they will gamble that they can avoid consequences. Without proportionality, they will either dismiss minor threats or feel that extreme consequences justify extreme resistance. Without consistency, they will test the boundaries constantly. I learnt to establish these psychological parameters through careful demonstration rather than through threats. When someone violated clearly established boundaries, I would respond with precisely the consequence I had previously established, delivered calmly and without anger. This taught everyone else that the system was reliable and predictable. The most effective fear-based influence targets what people value most: their reputation, their autonomy, their relationships, or their future opportunities. Physical fear is crude and often counterproductive. Psychological fear, the fear of losing face, losing control, or losing what they've worked to build, is far more powerful and sustainable. I discovered that people actually prefer relationships where boundaries are clear and consequences are predictable. Uncertainty creates more stress than firm boundaries do. When people know exactly what behavior will result in what consequences, they feel more secure and are more likely to maintain good relationships. However, fear-based influence must be balanced with positive reinforcement. People need to understand not just what they'll lose by opposing you, but what they'll gain by supporting you. The most effective approach combines clear consequences for negative behavior with genuine rewards for positive behavior. I also learned that fear must be personal and specific to be effective. General threats create general anxiety, but don't motivate specific behavior changes. When consequences are directly connected to individual choices and clearly affect things the person cares about, they become powerful motivators for compliance. The timing of consequences is crucial. Immediate consequences for boundary violations create stronger psychological associations than delayed consequences. When someone tests a boundary, the response must be swift and decisive, or the boundary begins to erode in everyone's mind. I watched leaders fail at fear-based influence by making threats they couldn't or wouldn't follow through on. Empty threats don't create fear, they create contempt. Once people realize you won't enforce your stated consequences, your ability to influence through fear disappears entirely. The most sophisticated application of the fear factor formula involves creating situations where people fear disappointing you more than they fear any external consequence. When you've built strong relationships and demonstrated genuine care for someone's success, the fear of losing your respect and support becomes more powerful than any punishment you could impose. But remember, fear should protect good people from bad actors, not terrorize good people into submission. The goal is creating an environment where everyone can succeed by following reasonable boundaries, not an environment where people live in constant anxiety about arbitrary punishment. When properly implemented, fear-based influence actually reduces conflict and increases trust, because everyone knows exactly where they stand and what to expect. It creates psychological safety through predictability, even when the consequences are serious. One of the most psychologically sophisticated lessons I learned came from observing Pope Alexander VI, who mastered the art of appearing virtuous while pursuing entirely practical goals. He taught me that in the realm of influence, perception often matters more than reality, and that the appearance of virtue can accomplish what actual virtue cannot. This revelation troubled me initially, as it seemed to suggest that moral behavior was less important than moral appearance. But through years of observation, I came to understand a more nuanced truth. The virtue facade isn't about deceiving people into thinking you're good when you're evil. It's about understanding that people need to believe in the virtue of those they follow, and that effective leaders must manage this psychological need. The human mind requires heroes and villains to make sense of complex situations. When people choose to follow someone, they need to feel good about that choice. They need to believe that supporting you aligns with their own values and moral identity. The virtue facade provides this psychological comfort while allowing you to make the difficult decisions that pure virtue would prevent. I learned this during my diplomatic missions when I watched leaders who were genuinely virtuous fail to achieve good outcomes because they couldn't make necessary compromises. Their moral purity prevented them from engaging in the strategic maneuvering required to protect their people's interests. Meanwhile, leaders who understood the virtue facade could maintain public support while making pragmatic decisions that actually served the greater good. The key insight is that people judge your virtue not by examining your every action, but by evaluating the overall impression you create. They form their opinion based on selected examples, public statements, and how your actions affect them personally. Master the virtue facade, and you can shape these perceptions to maintain influence while pursuing necessary but unpopular goals. The virtue facade operates on several psychological levels. First, people want to feel that their leaders share their moral values, even when those values conflict with practical necessities. Second, people need to feel that supporting you doesn't compromise their own moral identity. Third, people require justification for following leaders who make difficult decisions that pure virtue would prohibit. I developed techniques for maintaining the virtue facade while pursuing strategic goals. The most important is the principle of moral framing, presenting necessary but harsh decisions in terms of protecting higher virtues. When I had to recommend actions that seemed cruel, I framed them as protecting innocent people from greater harm. When advocating for strategic deception, I positioned it as preventing the greater deception that enemies might achieve. Another crucial element is the timing of virtuous displays. People remember what they see most recently and most frequently. By ensuring that your most visible and memorable actions align with commonly held virtues, you can maintain a virtuous reputation even when necessity requires less palatable decisions in private. I also learned the importance of authentic virtue in areas that don't conflict with strategic necessities. Genuine kindness to subordinates, honest dealing in personal relationships, and real commitment to stated principles in situations where virtue and strategy align. These authentic displays of virtue provide the foundation that makes the facade credible. The virtue facade also requires understanding which virtues matter most to your specific audience. Different groups prioritize different moral values. Military leaders must appear courageous and loyal. Religious leaders must appear pious and compassionate. Political leaders must appear just and dedicated to the common good. Tailor your facade to the virtues your audience values most highly. However, the virtue facade becomes dangerous when it's completely disconnected from actual virtue. People can sense authentic moral commitment even when it's combined with strategic pragmatism. If your virtue is entirely artificial, eventually someone will expose the discrepancy, and your influence will collapse catastrophically. I learned to think of the virtue facade not as hypocrisy, but as moral leadership that operates in an imperfect world. Sometimes protecting genuine virtue requires tactical flexibility about how virtue is expressed. Sometimes serving good outcomes requires making choices that pure virtue would reject, but practical wisdom demands. The most sophisticated application of the virtue facade involves creating situations where your strategic interests align with virtuous outcomes, then publicizing those situations heavily. When people see multiple examples of you choosing virtue over personal advantage, they develop faith in your character that will sustain your influence even when you must make more questionable choices. Remember, the goal isn't to appear virtuous while being evil. It's to maintain the psychological conditions necessary for good leadership, while making the difficult decisions that reality demands. My most valuable education in psychological influence came from studying the complex web of alliances that shaped Renaissance politics. I learnt that true power doesn't come from individual strength, but from creating networks where multiple people's success depends on your success. This alliance architecture becomes the foundation of sustainable influence. The breakthrough insight came while analyzing the Treaty of Cambrai, where I watched Pope Julius II orchestrate a coalition against Venice. By making each participant believe the alliance served their unique interests, the genius wasn't in the treaty terms themselves, but in how each party was convinced that supporting the Pope was the optimal way to achieve their own goals. Most people approach alliances backward. They think about what they need from others and try to negotiate for it. Master influencers think about what others need and position themselves as the pathway to providing it. This reversal in perspective transforms you from someone seeking favors into someone offering opportunities. The psychology behind effective alliance building rests on a fundamental truth. People are more committed to relationships where they feel valuable and valued. When someone believes that you genuinely need their specific contribution and that their success matters to you, they become psychologically invested in your success as well. I learned to identify what each potential ally valued most: recognition, security, growth, opportunities, or influence over others. Then I structured our relationship so that supporting me became the natural way for them to achieve what they wanted. The architecture of effective alliances requires understanding that different people contribute different types of value, and that sustainable networks include complementary strengths rather than redundant capabilities. I learned to think of alliance building like constructing a building. Each person must fulfill a specific structural role that supports the whole. Some allies provide information and intelligence. These are the people who naturally gather and share knowledge about opportunities, threats, and changing circumstances. Others provide credibility and reputation. Their association with you enhances your standing with groups you want to influence. Still others provide resources, connections, or specialized expertise that amplifies your capabilities. The most valuable allies are those who provide access to different networks and audiences. When someone trusts you and also has influence with groups you cannot reach directly, they become a bridge that extends your influence far beyond your personal capacity. I cultivated relationships with people who moved in different circles: merchants, scholars, clergy, and nobility, providing access to different sources of power and information. Discovered that alliance maintenance requires continuous attention to the psychological benefits each person receives from the relationship. People's needs and priorities change over time, and successful alliance architects adapt their approach accordingly. Someone who initially valued recognition might later prioritize security, requiring a shift in how you frame the benefits of continued cooperation. The most sophisticated alliances create what I call mutual indispensability, situations where each person's success genuinely depends on others' success, making the network self-reinforcing. When everyone has reasons to support everyone else, the alliance becomes stable, even when individual relationships face temporary strain. I learned to structure alliances with multiple layers of mutual benefit. The obvious layer involves direct exchanges. I help you achieve something, you help me achieve something else. But the deeper layer involves emotional and psychological benefits, enhanced reputation, sense of belonging to something important, opportunities to exercise influence and expertise. However, alliance architecture becomes dangerous when relationships become purely transactional. People need to feel genuine personal connection and respect, not just mutual utility. The strongest alliances combine practical benefits with authentic relationships, built on shared values and genuine appreciation for each other's contributions. I also discovered the importance of managing alliance dynamics carefully. When you bring different people together, you must consider how their personalities, interests, and communication styles will interact. Some combinations create synergy and mutual reinforcement. Others create tension that undermines the entire network. The key to sustainable alliance architecture is ensuring that everyone wins more together than they could win separately, while making your role as connector and coordinator valuable enough that maintaining the alliance requires maintaining their relationship with you. You become the central hub that makes the entire network function effectively. Most importantly, I learned that alliance architecture requires long-term thinking. The relationships you build today may not provide immediate benefits, but they create options and opportunities that become valuable when circumstances change. The person who seems least useful now might become crucial later, and the person who provides the most value now might need your support in the future. Effective alliance architecture transforms influence from a personal capacity into a network capacity, multiplying your reach and impact far beyond what any individual could achieve alone. The greatest source of psychological power I ever discovered wasn't wealth, position, or even charisma. It was information. During my years in government, I developed an extensive network of informants and observers that gave me knowledge others lacked. This information advantage transformed me from a participant in political games into someone who could predict and influence their outcomes. Information provides psychological power through three mechanisms. It allows you to anticipate other people's behavior and prepare accordingly. It gives you insights into their motivations and vulnerabilities that inform your influence strategies, and it creates an aura of competence and foresight that makes others more likely to trust your judgment and follow your guidance. I learnt this lesson during negotiations with the French court, where I initially struggled because I understood only the surface positions of various officials. Everything changed when I developed sources who could tell me about their private concerns, personal relationships, and behind-the-scenes pressures. Armed with this deeper knowledge, I could craft approaches that addressed their real needs rather than their stated positions. The key insight is that people rarely reveal their true motivations directly. They present public positions that make them look reasonable and principled. While their actual decisions are driven by private concerns they would be embarrassed to admit. Understanding this gap between public positions and private motivations is the foundation of psychological influence. I developed systematic approaches to gathering information that went far beyond casual observation. I learned to ask questions that revealed more than people intended to share, to notice discrepancies between what people said and how they behaved, and to piece together larger patterns from fragments of information gathered from multiple sources. The most valuable information concerns people's fears, ambitions, relationships, and constraints. When you understand what someone is afraid of losing, what they hope to gain, who they need to please, and what limitations they face, you can predict their behavior with remarkable accuracy. This predictive power allows you to position yourself advantageously before others even recognize opportunities or threats. I also learned that information gathering must be strategic and systematic, not random. I focused on understanding the key decision makers in any situation, what influenced them, what they cared about most, and what would motivate them to change their current approach. Gathering information about irrelevant people or irrelevant details wastes time and energy. The art of strategic listening became one of my most powerful tools. Most people are eager to talk about themselves and their concerns when they feel heard and understood. I learned to ask follow-up questions that encouraged people to reveal more, to remain silent at moments when others felt compelled to fill the silence, and to remember details that people mentioned casually but which revealed important patterns. However, information advantage requires careful management of what you know and when you reveal it. Demonstrating too much knowledge too early can make people suspicious or defensive. The goal is to use information to inform your approach, not to prove how much you know. People should feel that you understand them without feeling that you've been spying on them. I developed techniques for protecting sensitive information while still benefiting from it. Sometimes this meant attributing insights to logical deduction rather than specific intelligence. Other times it meant waiting for natural opportunities to apply what I knew rather than forcing situations that would reveal my information sources. The information advantage also includes understanding larger patterns and trends that others miss, because they're focused on immediate concerns. By gathering information from multiple sources and synthesizing it into broader insights, you can often see opportunities and threats before they become obvious to everyone else. I learned that the most valuable information is often emotional rather than factual. Understanding how someone feels about a situation, what they're worried about, or what would make them feel successful is often more useful than knowing the objective details of their circumstances. The psychology behind information-based influence is that people naturally trust and defer to those who demonstrate superior understanding of complex situations. When you consistently show insight into situations and people that others find puzzling, you develop a reputation for wisdom and foresight that enhances your influence in all contexts. But remember, information gathering must serve the interests of better outcomes and improved relationships, not mere curiosity or desire for control. The goal is understanding people well enough to help them achieve what they want while accomplishing what you need. During my exile, I spent countless hours studying the movements of celestial bodies and their influence on human behavior. This led me to discover that psychological influence operates according to rhythms and patterns just as predictable as astronomical cycles. Master timing, and even mediocre ideas can succeed brilliantly. Ignore timing, and even brilliant ideas will fail. The revelation came while observing how the same proposal could be enthusiastically accepted one day and categorically rejected the next, with no change in the proposal itself. The only variable was timing the psychological state of the decision-maker, the external pressures they faced, and the broader context surrounding the decision. I learned that human psychology operates on multiple overlapping cycles: daily energy patterns, weekly emotional rhythms, seasonal mood variations, and longer cycles related to personal and professional circumstances. Understanding these patterns allows you to predict when someone will be most receptive to influence and when they will be most resistant. Most people experience predictable daily psychological rhythms. Morning hours often bring optimism and openness to new ideas, as mental energy is fresh and defensive barriers are lower. Midday can be optimal for collaborative discussions when energy is high but not overwhelming. Late afternoon often brings fatigue that makes people more susceptible to gentle influence but resistant to high-pressure approaches. Evening hours can be ideal for personal conversations when people's professional masks drop and authentic communication becomes possible. I also discovered weekly psychological patterns. Monday mornings often find people overwhelmed by accumulated tasks and resistant to additional commitments. Wednesday afternoons can be optimal for important conversations, as the week's stress hasn't yet peaked, but momentum has built. Friday afternoons are excellent for positive conversations, but terrible for serious confrontations. As people's attention turns toward rest and recreation, seasonal variations affect psychology as well. Spring brings renewal and optimism that make people open to new ventures and changes. Summer energy supports active projects and collaborative efforts. Autumn often triggers evaluation and reflection that can support strategic conversations about improvement. Winter can be ideal for intimate, serious discussions when people naturally turn inward. But the most powerful timing insights concern individual psychological seasons rather than calendar seasons. Every person moves through cycles of confidence and insecurity, optimism and pessimism, expansion and consolidation. Learn to read these personal seasons, and you can time your influence attempts for maximum effectiveness. I learned to recognize the signs that someone was entering a psychologically receptive phase: increased willingness to discuss problems openly, requests for advice or input, expressions of uncertainty about current approaches, or enthusiasm about new possibilities. Conversely, I learned to avoid influence attempts when people showed signs of psychological closure, defensive responses to questions, insistence that everything was fine, rigid adherence to established plans, or dismissive attitudes toward new information. The art of timing also involves understanding external factors that affect receptivity. People are more open to influence when they feel successful and confident, but also when they face new challenges that exceed their current capabilities. They are more resistant when they feel threatened or when they've recently committed publicly to specific positions. I developed the ability to create optimal timing rather than simply wait for it. By asking strategic questions or sharing relevant information, you can shift someone from a closed psychological state to an open one. By timing your approach, to coincide with natural pressure points or decision deadlines. You increase the likelihood that your input will be welcomed rather than resisted. However, timing mastery requires patience and discipline. The temptation to push forward when timing is wrong often destroys opportunities that patience would have created. I learned to postpone important conversations, delay significant requests, and wait for psychological windows to open rather than forcing interactions when conditions were unfavorable. The most sophisticated timing strategies involve orchestrating multiple influences to converge at optimal moments. This might mean coordinating with allies to reinforce your message, timing your approach to coincide with external events that support your position, or building momentum through a series of smaller interactions that prepare someone for a larger request. Master timing, and influence becomes a matter of precision rather than force striking at exactly the moment when your target is most ready to receive what you're offering. In the Medici Palace, I often played chess with Lorenzo's son, who taught me that the greatest players think not just about their next move, but about how their opponent will respond to that move, and how they will respond to that response. This lesson transformed my understanding of psychological influence. From a simple transaction into a complex strategic game, emotional chess differs from regular chess in one crucial way. Instead of moving pieces on a board, you're moving emotions, expectations, and psychological states. Every interaction creates ripple effects that influence future interactions. Master players learn to think multiple moves ahead, anticipating not just immediate responses, but the chain reactions their actions will create. The key insight is that people's emotional states are constantly shifting based on their interactions and experiences. When you influence someone's emotional state, you don't just affect their immediate decision, you influence their readiness for future interactions, their expectations about your relationship, and their psychological preparation for whatever comes next. I learned this during my diplomatic negotiations with various Italian princes. Early in my career, I focused only on winning individual conversations or meetings, but I noticed that victories achieved through emotional manipulation often created resentment that poisoned future interactions. Conversely, approaches that left people feeling good about themselves and the interaction created positive momentum that made subsequent negotiations easier. The emotional chess game requires understanding that every person you interact with is simultaneously playing their own psychological game. They have goals they're trying to achieve, emotions they're trying to manage, and impressions they're trying to create. Your influence attempts must account for their game as well as your own. I developed the ability to read multiple moves ahead by asking myself, if I take this approach now, how will they feel afterward? How will that emotional state affect their openness to my next request? If they respond the way I expect, what will be my best follow-up move? If they respond differently than expected, what alternative strategies do I have available? The most sophisticated emotional chess involves managing not just immediate emotional states, but longer-term psychological positioning. For example, I learned that allowing someone to win a small victory in one interaction often set up larger victories. For me, in future interactions, they would approach subsequent conversations feeling confident and generous, making them more receptive to significant requests. I also discovered the power of emotional investment strategies. By getting someone emotionally invested in a particular outcome or relationship, I could influence their behavior in future situations where that investment was relevant. Someone who had publicly supported one of my proposals would be psychologically motivated to support related proposals later. To maintain consistency with their earlier position, the timing of emotional moves became crucial to my strategy. I learned that certain emotional states were optimal for specific types of requests. Gratitude created openness to new requests for help. Curiosity created receptivity to new information. Confidence created willingness to take risks. By managing the sequence of emotional states, I could guide people through complex decision-making processes. However, emotional chess requires genuine care for your opponent's well-being. If you're purely manipulating emotions for selfish gain, people will eventually sense the manipulation and respond with hostility. The most effective emotional chess players create situations where both parties genuinely benefit, using emotional influence to guide people toward mutually positive outcomes. I learned to distinguish between short-term emotional tactics and long-term emotional strategy. Short-term tactics might involve creating specific feelings to influence immediate decisions. Long-term strategy involves building emotional foundations that support ongoing influence, trust, respect, affection, and mutual investment. The emotional chess game also requires managing your own emotional state strategically. Your emotions influence others' emotions, so maintaining the psychological state you want to create in others becomes essential. If you want someone to feel calm and thoughtful, you must embody calm thoughtfulness. If you want them to feel energized and optimistic, you must project energy and optimism. I developed techniques for emotional state management that allowed me to maintain strategic emotional control even in challenging situations. This involved physical preparation, mental preparation, and behavioral techniques that helped me project the emotional energy most likely to create the responses I needed. The master level of emotional chess involves creating emotional experiences that people remember and associate with you long after specific conversations are forgotten. When someone thinks of you, what emotional state do they naturally enter? That emotional association becomes the foundation for all future influence attempts. Remember, the goal isn't to manipulate emotions for selfish purposes, but to create emotional experiences that serve everyone's legitimate interests while advancing your ability to create positive outcomes. One of the most painful lessons I learned about influence came from studying mercenary soldiers, fighters who could be hired by anyone willing to pay their price. Their psychology taught me the crucial distinction between people who can be genuinely influenced and those who can only be temporarily bought, and why understanding this difference prevents devastating strategic mistakes. The revelation came during my analysis of various military campaigns, where princes who relied heavily on mercenary forces found themselves abandoned at crucial moments. These soldiers had no genuine loyalty to their employers' causes. They fought only as long as the payment continued and the risks remained acceptable. When circumstances changed, they simply switched sides or disappeared entirely. I realized that the same psychological pattern appears in all relationships, not just military ones. Some people can develop genuine commitment to shared goals and mutual benefit. Others operate purely on transactional terms, supporting you only as long as immediate self-interest demands it. Confusing these two types of people leads to catastrophic errors in influence strategy. Mercenary minds are driven by immediate, tangible benefits. They evaluate every interaction based on what do I get right now, and what does this cost me today. Their support is reliable only as long as the cost-benefit analysis remains favorable to them. Change the circumstances, and their loyalty vanishes instantly. I learned to identify mercenary psychology through specific behavioral patterns. These individuals focus conversations on immediate benefits rather than long-term outcomes. They frequently calculate and recalculate what they're receiving versus what they're giving. They show little interest in abstract principles or future possibilities. Their commitment lasts only as long as alternative opportunities aren't available. Conversely, people with genuine loyalty capacity think about relationships in terms of mutual growth, shared values, and long-term outcomes. They're willing to make short-term sacrifices for long-term benefits. They maintain commitments even when immediate Circumstances become challenging. They derive satisfaction from the success of people and causes they care about. The strategic error most leaders make is trying to build genuine loyalty with mercenary minds. No amount of benefit sharing, trust building, or relationship investment will create lasting commitment from someone whose psychology operates purely on transactional terms. You're better off acknowledging their mercenary nature and managing the relationship accordingly. However, this doesn't mean mercenary relationships are worthless. When managed properly, they can provide significant value. The key is understanding their limitations and never depending on them for anything requiring genuine commitment or loyalty. Use mercenaries for tasks where their immediate self-interest aligns with your needs, but never trust them with anything crucial to your long-term success. I developed strategies for identifying people's underlying loyalty capacity early in relationships. I would observe how they talked about past relationships, how they responded to delayed gratification, and whether they showed genuine interest in outcomes that didn't directly benefit them. People with genuine loyalty capacity demonstrated consistent patterns of putting group success ahead of immediate personal gain. The most dangerous situation occurs when you mistake a mercenary mind for a loyal ally. These individuals can cause tremendous damage because you've given them access to sensitive information, important responsibilities, or crucial relationships based on a fundamental misunderstanding of their psychology. When their interests shift, they take all of that access with them. I learned to structure relationships with mercenary minds very differently than relationships with genuine allies. With mercenaries, I focused on clear, immediate exchanges with minimal trust requirements. I never shared sensitive information, never gave them access to my other relationships, and never made my success dependent on their continued cooperation. With genuine allies, I invested in long-term relationship building, shared important information, created mutual dependencies, and worked to align our long-term interests. These relationships required more initial investment, but provided much greater strategic value over time. The sophisticated application of this principle involves creating different layers of relationships within your influence network. Your innermost circle consists of people with proven loyalty capacity who genuinely care about your success. The next layer includes competent people whose interests align with yours for extended periods. The outer layer includes mercenary minds who can provide specific value under specific circumstances. However, I also learned that people can evolve from mercenary psychology toward genuine loyalty capacity, especially when they experience the benefits of committed relationships over time. Some individuals who initially operate purely on transactional terms can develop emotional investment and long-term thinking when consistently treated with respect and fairness. The key is never assuming this evolution will occur, but remaining open to it when it does. Continue managing someone as a mercenary until they demonstrate genuine loyalty capacity through their actions over extended periods, not just their words. Understanding the mercenary mind protects you from strategic vulnerabilities while helping you build influence networks that combine immediate tactical capabilities with long-term strategic assets. Near the end of my life, while writing letters to my friend Francesco Vittori, I made a profound discovery. The most powerful influence isn't what you accomplish during your lifetime, but what continues to happen because of your influence after you're gone. True psychological mastery creates self-perpetuating systems that extend your impact far beyond your personal presence. This realization came as I reflected on leaders whose influence had lasted centuries versus those who were forgotten within years of their deaths. The difference wasn't in their immediate power or even their accomplishments, but in whether they had created ideas, relationships, and systems that could function independently of their personal involvement. Legacy influence operates on 3 levels: the people you've influenced who continue to apply your principles, the ideas you've planted that continue to spread and evolve, and the systems you've created that continue to function according to your original vision. Master all three, and your influence becomes virtually immortal. The first level requires understanding that every person you influence becomes a potential multiplier of your influence. When you teach someone principles that genuinely improve their effectiveness, they naturally share those principles with others. When you model behavior that produces positive results, others adopt and adapt that behavior. When you create positive experiences for people, they seek to recreate those experiences in their own relationships. I learned to think of influence as an investment that pays dividends long after the initial transaction. Instead of focusing solely on immediate outcomes, I began asking, what will this person remember about this interaction? What principles will they extract from this experience? How will this influence their approach to similar situations in the future? The most powerful legacy influence comes from teaching people to think differently rather than just to do different things. When you change how someone processes information, makes decisions, or approaches problems, you influence thousands of future decisions they haven't even encountered yet. This is far more valuable than influencing any single choice or action. The second level involves creating ideas that take on lives of their own. The most influential people in history aren't necessarily those who accumulated the most power during their lifetimes, but those who introduced concepts that continued to shape thinking long after they died. These ideas become tools that others use to understand and influence their own situations. I learned to express insights in forms that others could easily remember, apply, and share. Instead of just solving immediate problems, I try to identify underlying principles that could be applied to many different situations. Instead of just giving advice for specific circumstances, I developed frameworks that people could use to analyze new challenges. The third level requires building systems and structures that embody your influence principles and continue to operate according to your vision even when you're not personally directing them. This might mean establishing organizational processes, creating institutional cultures, or developing networks of relationships that reinforce your influence approach. I discovered that legacy influence requires balancing consistency with adaptability. Your core principles must remain stable enough that people can rely on them and build upon them, but your methods must be flexible enough that others can adapt them to new circumstances and challenges you never anticipated. The psychology behind lasting influence involves understanding that people need to feel ownership over the ideas and methods they adopt from you. If they experience your influence as external control, it will fade when you're no longer present to enforce it. If they experience your influence as enhancement of their own capabilities, it becomes part of their identity and continues indefinitely. I learned to influence people in ways that made them feel more capable and effective, not more dependent on me. When someone succeeds using principles they learned from you, but experiences that success as their own achievement, they become permanent advocates for those principles. They will teach them to others because the principles have become part of their own success story. Legacy influence also requires understanding that your influence will be tested and refined by others over time. The ideas and methods that survive and spread are those that prove valuable across different contexts and challenges. This means your influence must be based on genuine insights into human nature and practical effectiveness, not just personal charisma or temporary circumstances. I spent my final years documenting not just what I had learned, but how I had learned it, so that others could continue the process of discovery and refinement. The goal wasn't to create rigid dogma, but to provide tools and insights that others could use to develop their own influence mastery. The ultimate test of your influence is whether the people you've influenced become more influential themselves, and whether they use that influence to create positive outcomes that extend your impact into areas and relationships you could never have reached personally. When you master legacy influence, you transform from someone who exercises power into someone who creates power in others, and that transformation ensures your influence will continue long after your personal involvement ends. 500 years have passed since I walked the halls of Renaissance palaces, yet the psychological principles I discovered remain as relevant today as they were in my time. Human nature hasn't changed, only the environments in which that nature operates. Let me show you how to apply these timeless influence strategies to the modern world of offices, digital communications, and contemporary relationships. The workplace has become the new court, where psychological influence determines who advances and who remains stagnant. The same principles that helped me navigate PayPal politics can help you navigate corporate hierarchies, team dynamics, and professional relationships. The stakes may be different, but the psychology remains identical. Consider the mirror principle. In modern team meetings, instead of trying to impress colleagues with your own ideas, first reflect back what matters most to them. If your manager values efficiency, frame your proposals in terms of time savings and streamlined processes. If your team prioritizes innovation, position your suggestions as creative solutions to existing challenges. The content might be identical, but the psychological impact transforms completely. The fortune wheel strategy proves crucial in timing your career moves and important requests. Learn to read your organization's psychological seasons, budget cycles, performance review periods, leadership transitions, and project deadlines. A promotion request that would be dismissed during a stressful quarter might be enthusiastically received during a period of growth and optimism. In our digital age, the alliance architecture becomes even more powerful. Professional networks, social media connections, and online communities create unprecedented opportunities to build influence relationships across geographic and organizational boundaries. The same principles of mutual benefit and strategic positioning apply, but the potential reach extends globally. Modern information gathering doesn't require spy networks, it requires strategic attention to publicly available information. LinkedIn profiles, company announcements, social media activity, and industry publications provide vast intelligence about people's motivations, challenges, and opportunities. The key is synthesizing this information into psychological insights, rather than just collecting facts. The loyalty equation operates powerfully in contemporary team dynamics. Instead of trying to win loyalty through benefits or kindness, create opportunities for colleagues to invest in shared projects and mutual success. When someone contributes their expertise to your initiative, they become psychologically invested in its success. When you help someone achieve their goals while accomplishing your own, you create lasting alliance bonds. Email and digital communication require careful application of the virtue facade. Your online presence becomes your reputation management tool. Ensure that your most visible communications demonstrate the qualities you want people to associate with you: competence, reliability, strategic thinking, or collaborative spirit. People form lasting impressions based on limited digital interactions. The fear factor formula adapts to modern contexts as consequences related to reputation, opportunities, and professional relationships. You don't need to threaten anyone explicitly. Simply by demonstrating reliability in following through on commitments and consistency in your standards, you create psychological awareness that supporting you leads to positive outcomes, while opposing you leads to missed opportunities. Remote work environments make the emotional chess game more challenging but equally important. Video calls require heightened attention to emotional states and psychological timing. Learn to read energy levels stress indicators, and receptivity signals through digital channels. The delayed nature of email and messaging requires thinking. Multiple exchanges ahead to guide conversations toward desired outcomes. The art of necessary deception becomes crucial in managing complex stakeholder relationships. This doesn't mean lying, but rather understanding which information to emphasize with different audiences. The technical details that excite engineers might overwhelm executives, while the strategic vision that inspires leadership might bore operational teams. Tailor your truth-telling to what each audience needs to hear to make good decisions. Modern application of the lion and the fox method requires reading whether situations call for direct communication or subtle influence. Some workplace cultures reward assertive, straightforward approaches. Others penalize directness and require diplomatic maneuvering. Some individuals respond to clear expectations and firm boundaries, while others need collaborative exploration and gentle guidance. Social media and professional platforms create new opportunities for demonstrating competence and building influence relationships, but they also require careful management of your psychological positioning. Every post, comment, and interaction contributes to how people perceive your expertise, judgment, and character. The key to modern Machiavellian application is understanding that these principles must serve ethical purposes and create genuine value for everyone involved. The goal isn't to manipulate people for selfish gain, but to become more effective at creating positive outcomes in complex human systems. These strategies work because they align with how human psychology actually operates, rather than how we wish it operated. When you understand and work with human nature instead of against it, you can accomplish far more while building stronger, more satisfying relationships with the people around you. Now that you possess the same psychological insights that guided me through the treacherous courts of Renaissance Italy, you face the same challenge I once faced, transforming knowledge into personal mastery. Understanding these principles intellectually is only the beginning. True influence mastery requires deliberate practice, careful observation, and gradual integration of these strategies into your daily interactions. Begin by honestly assessing your current influence level. Do people seek your opinions on important decisions? Do they remember and reference ideas you've shared? When you make requests, do people respond positively? When conflicts arise, do people look to you for solutions? Your answers reveal your starting point for this transformation journey. The most powerful first step is developing your observation skills. For the next week, watch every interaction through the lens of psychological influence. Notice when people become more or less receptive during conversations. Observe which communication styles different personalities respond to best. Pay attention to timing patterns, when people seem most open to new ideas, and when they seem most resistant. Start applying the mirror principle in low-stakes situations. Practice reflecting back what people value most about themselves. With a colleague who prides themselves on attention to detail, acknowledge their thoroughness before presenting new ideas. With someone who values innovation, position your suggestions as creative solutions. Notice how this changes the quality of your interactions. Experiment with the fortune wheel strategy by timing your requests and important conversations more strategically. Avoid approaching people when they're stressed, overwhelmed, or focused on other priorities. Learn to recognize when someone is in a psychologically receptive state and take advantage of those moments for meaningful discussions. Begin building your alliance architecture by identifying people whose success could be connected to your success. Look for opportunities to contribute to their goals while advancing your own. Offer expertise, make introductions, or provide support in ways that create mutual benefit and psychological investment in your relationship. Practice the lion and the fox method by adapting your communication style to different personalities. and situations. With direct, results-oriented people, be clear and concise. With relationship-focused individuals, invest time in personal connection before discussing business. Notice how different approaches affect your effectiveness with different people. Develop your information-gathering capabilities by becoming a more strategic listener. Ask follow-up questions that encourage people to share more than they intended. Pay attention to emotional undertones and what people don't say directly. Remember details that reveal patterns about what motivates different individuals. Apply the virtue facade by ensuring your most visible actions align with qualities you want people to associate with you. If you want to be seen as reliable, follow through meticulously on small commitments. If you want to be viewed as strategic, ask thoughtful questions that demonstrate long-term thinking. Use the emotional chess game by thinking 1 or 2 moves ahead in important interactions. Before significant conversations, consider how different approaches might affect the other person's emotional state and their openness to future interactions. Plan your sequence of requests or suggestions to build momentum rather than trigger resistance. As you practice these techniques, remember that mastery requires patience and persistence. Don't expect immediate transformation influence skills. Develop gradually through consistent application and refinement. Focus on small improvements rather than dramatic changes, and celebrate progress rather than demanding perfection. Keep a simple influence journal where you record what approaches work well with different people and in different situations. Note successful applications of these principles and analyze interactions that don't go as planned. This reflection process accelerates your learning and helps you adapt the principles to your unique circumstances. Most importantly, remember that these psychological insights must serve ethical purposes. Use your growing influence to create positive outcomes for everyone involved, not just to advance your personal agenda. The most sustainable influence comes from genuinely helping others achieve their goals while accomplishing your own. The principles I've shared with you have guided leaders for over 5 centuries because they reflect fundamental truths about human psychology. Now it's your turn to apply this timeless wisdom to create the influence, impact, and success you deserve. Your transformation from someone who struggles for recognition to someone whose voice naturally commands attention begins with your very next interaction. Choose to apply what you've learned, observe the results, and continue building your influence mastery, one conversation at a time. The courts of Renaissance Italy were dangerous places where influence meant survival. Your modern challenges may be different, but the psychological tools you now possess are exactly what you need to navigate them successfully. Use them wisely, and watch as your ability to influence others and create the outcomes you desire transforms completely.